Your phone is in your hand right now. The name on the screen is one you recognize without thinking. One your nervous system recognized before your mind even caught up. A message. After all this time, after all that silence, and your heart is doing something you did not ask it to do. Hope, fear, anger. Something that feels dangerously close to relief. All of it arriving at once, uninvited, impossible to sort. And beneath all of it, one question that is louder than the rest: why now? After everything, after all that silence, why now? What you are feeling is not weakness. It is not confusion you should be embarrassed by. The return of someone who chose silence is never a neutral event. It does not arrive quietly. It reactivates everything you thought you had set aside. Every conversation you rehearsed in your head. Every moment you finally thought you were free of the weight of it. Every morning you woke up, and it was the first thing you felt before you were even fully awake. What psychology shows us about why people return after choosing distance is not what most people assume, and it is not what the person reaching out will tell you. The reasons they give, and the reasons actually driving them back are rarely the same thing, not always because they are lying, but because the human mind is genuinely poor at understanding its own deeper motivations. Before you respond, before you decide what this means, before you let hope or hurt make the choice for you, here is what psychology reveals about why someone comes back after choosing to disappear. And once you understand the real reasons, you will never see their return the same way again. Here is something worth understanding before we go any further. People who return after long silence are not lying when they tell you why. Most of them believe what they say. But behavioral psychology has shown us repeatedly that the reasons we give for our actions and the psychological forces actually driving those actions are often two entirely different things. We explain ourselves with the story that feels true. We rarely have access to the mechanism running beneath it. What follows are the real reasons, the ones confirmed by research, by neuroscience, by the patterns that repeat across thousands of relationships and countless acts of return, not the reasons you hope for, not the reasons that sting, the true ones. And understanding them is not about deciding anything yet. It is about seeing clearly before you move. The first reason someone returns after long silence is what psychology calls the contrast effect, and it is more powerful than most people realize. When a person walks away from a meaningful connection, their brain does not reset. It does not return to zero. It establishes that connection as the emotional baseline, the internal standard against which every subsequent experience is quietly, unconsciously measured. Every new conversation, every new presence, every attempt at something that resembles what they left. All of it gets evaluated against what existed before, whether they are aware of that process or not. They left imagining what came next would be better, or easier, or at minimum comparable. What psychology shows us is that genuine emotional connections create a measurement standard that is invisible until you try to replace it. The contrast effect is not dramatic. It does not arrive all at once. It accumulates one "this is fine, but it is not quite right" experience at a time, until the gap between what they have and what they left becomes impossible to ignore. And so they reach back out, not necessarily because they have changed, not necessarily because they are ready, but because nothing else has measured up. If this is why they returned, here is what that actually means for you. You were the standard. You set a bar that nothing else could clear. That is significant, it is real, but it is also critical to understand the difference between being someone's standard and being someone they are now, capable of meeting where you are. Those are not the same thing. Their return is not proof that you were right for them. It is proof that you were the measure of right. That distinction matters more than it might feel like it does right now. But contrast alone does not drive someone back across months of silence. There is something deeper that happens when time does not heal the way they expected it to. The second reason is one that psychology has named precisely, and once you understand it, you will recognize it immediately. It is called the Zeigarnik effect, and it is the reason the human mind refuses to let go of what was never finished. Research shows us that unresolved experiences, unfinished conversations, incomplete endings, things that were left unsaid, occupy the mind with far greater persistence than things that were properly closed. When a relationship or connection ends without true closure, the mind does not file it under over, it files it under unfinished, and unfinished things have a way of staying open, staying active, surfacing at unexpected moments long after you thought they had gone quiet. Months pass. Silence stretches. But beneath the surface, the lack of resolution keeps that connection alive in their mind in ways they may not consciously recognize. It appears in quiet moments. It refuses to fully settle. And eventually, the pull to close the loop, to finish what was left unfinished, to say what was never said, to understand what was never understood, becomes stronger than the silence they chose. If this is why they returned, it is important to understand what their need actually is. It is not necessarily to rebuild. It may simply be to resolve, to end what never got a proper ending. That process can be healing for both people. There is nothing wrong with acknowledging that, but resolution for them may not mean reconnection. It may simply mean peace for them. And what you do with that understanding is something only you can decide. Their return is not always an invitation back in. Sometimes it is the final chapter of something that needed an ending it never got. But here is where the psychology becomes harder to hear, and more important to understand. The third reason is the one most people do not want to consider. It is the one that competitor videos in this space rarely have the honesty to name. But psychology confirms it, and you deserve to know it. Sometimes a person reaches out after long silence not because they want to rebuild, not because they have grown, not because they have realized what they lost, but because they need to know they still can, that the door is still open, that their presence still registers, that they still hold a place in your emotional world. What behavioral psychology calls ego-protective, reassurance-seeking behavior is one of the most common and least acknowledged drivers of contact after silence. And here is the mechanism that makes it so hard to see in the moment. It often arrives not when things are going well for them, but when something in their life has made them feel uncertain, a rejection, a failure, a moment where their sense of their own worth became unstable. And in that moment of internal instability, the mind reaches toward evidence of value, toward proof of mattering, toward someone who once cared deeply. Because if that person still responds warmly, if that door is still open, then they still matter. They are still significant. They are still wanted by someone. You, in this scenario, are not the destination. You are the test. And the part that makes this so important to understand, once that confirmation arrives, once you respond, once warmth is returned, the need that drove them to reach out can quietly dissolve. Because it was never really about you. It was about them, about a moment they felt small, about needing evidence that they were still worth something to someone. You are not required to be the evidence of someone else's worth, especially not when they offered no evidence of yours during the silence. This is not a reason to feel anger. It is a reason to feel clear, to ask before you respond with your whole heart, whether you are being seen as a person or used as a mirror. But not every return is ego. Not every reach across silence is about need. Sometimes, rarely, but sometimes, the reason is as simple and honest as this. The fourth reason is the only one on this list that is genuinely fully about you. Not about what you represented, not about what you offered, about you, the specific, irreplaceable person you are. Psychology has documented what researchers call effective forecasting failure, the human tendency to be remarkably poor at predicting how we will feel in the future, especially about loss. When someone walks away from a connection, they forecast what life will feel like without that person. They imagine relief, freedom, space, what they cannot predict. From inside the comfort of a decision not yet lived is the specific weight of your particular absence, the exact shape of what you left behind, the silence that your presence used to fill. Time passes. The initial sense of release fades, and slowly, without drama, the understanding arrives. What they walked away from was not just good. It was rare, the kind of rare that does not get replaced, the kind of rare that only reveals its full value once it is gone and you have spent enough time looking for it somewhere else and not finding it. When that understanding lands, not as an intellectual idea but as a felt, undeniable truth, some people do the hardest thing they will ever do. They reach back out, knowing they may be too late, knowing they may have burned what they are hoping to rebuild, reaching out anyway because the truth of what they lost has become heavier than their pride. If this is why they returned, listen carefully. This is worth something. It is real. It is the reason worth taking seriously, worth having a conversation about. But realization is not the same as transformation. Understanding what they lost is where the work begins, not where it ends. They must also be different. They must bring evidence. Genuine clarity, not just genuine feeling. Feeling without change is just regret dressed as hope. And then there is the reason that is hardest to name and hardest to navigate. The fifth reason requires the most emotional maturity to hold, because it does not fit neatly into hope or hurt. It lives in the space between both. Life transition theory and psychology tells us that human beings move through readiness, states, periods of life where our internal capacity to engage fully with certain things is either available or genuinely not. And sometimes two people connect at a moment when one of them is not in a readiness state for what that connection requires. They are in the middle of grief, career collapse, personal crisis, healing from something that came before, and they make the painful, sometimes necessary choice to step back. Not because the connection is wrong, not because you are not worth showing up for, but because they are genuinely not capable of showing up the way it deserves. Time passes, the crisis resolves, the grief softens, the internal work gets done, and for the first time in a long time, they have the capacity on the actual emotional bandwidth to be present in a connection, to offer consistency, to hold something that is worth holding. And when they arrive at that place, their mind returns to the person they had to step away from, not because you are a backup, but because you were always the right person. And they are finally, genuinely ready. Here is the truth you must hold at the same time. You lived through the silence. You carried the weight of their absence through every day they were not there. You did not get to wait for their readiness and peace. You had to build your own life around their absence, without being asked whether you were ready for that. And whatever readiness they have found must be weighed against a reality they may not fully see. You may no longer be in the same emotional place you were when they left. You may have grown in directions that changed what you need. You may have found your own readiness for something entirely different. They may be ready now, but that does not mean you are required to be ready for them. Here is what matters more than any of these reasons. When someone returns after long silence, why they came back matters less than what they bring with them when they do. Words are easy. Reaching out is easy. What is hard, what actually tells you something true, is whether they return with genuine accountability, with clarity about what broke the first time and honest evidence of what has changed since. Without those things, even the most sincere reason for returning is not enough, because a person who realized what they lost can still repeat the pattern that created the loss. Realization alone does not rewrite behavior, and you do not just deserve someone who understood what you meant to them. You deserve someone who will not need silence to teach them that lesson twice. Your heart is not wrong for feeling what it felt when that message arrived. Hope is not a character flaw, neither is the fear that came with it or the anger, or the part of you that is still deciding whether to feel anything at all. All of it is evidence that what existed between you was real. You do not manufacture that kind of response to something that never mattered. But here is what you do not need to do right now. You do not need to have the answer. You do not need to respond before you are ready. You do not need to perform certainty or clarity or resolution you have not yet found. What you need is time, space, the freedom to feel everything you are feeling without rushing it into a decision before the full picture has had time to come into focus. If you choose to engage, if you decide this is worth exploring, here is what psychology asks you to pay attention to. Not what they say, what they demonstrate, not the reason they give for coming back. The evidence they bring that they are different from who they were when they left, not their words about having changed. Their actions over time, proving that change is real and not just present because they want something from you. And here is something that needs to be said plainly. If they left, the leaving was theirs. If the silence stretched for months or years, the silence was theirs. Not one moment of it was a reflection of your insufficiency. You were never too much, never too intense, never too present, too real, too honest, too alive in the way you loved. You were always enough. The question was never whether you were enough. The question was always whether they were ready. Ready to receive it, to hold it, to stay for it. You deserve more than someone who returns. You deserve someone who does not require absence to understand your value. Someone whose presence in your life does not depend on whether they happened to find something better and did not. Someone who sees you clearly, completely, and chooses you the first time, without the silence in between. Their return is not a gift you were waiting for. It is information you now have. And what you choose to do with that information is entirely, completely, and only yours to decide. If this gave you the clarity you were looking for, please leave a like, not as a favor, but as a signal that this kind of honest psychology is what you came here for. Subscribe if you want to keep understanding the patterns that most people never have the language for. You are not alone in this decision. You never have to be.